Okay, so good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our Powering Podiums. Just before we get started, just a quick thank you to people I work with at CSI Pacific. We've got Candice Drouin with us today, and Drew, and also Drouin. So we're going to be working together as a team, and obviously just wanted to say thank you to everybody for logging on and coming to join us for this session, and hope everyone is doing fine, and everyone's family as well, and we're managing to get through this situation that we find ourselves in. Now it's been a little bit relaxed, so hoping that everyone is doing okay. So today we're going to talk about adapting athlete targeting during this challenging time. Just a little bit of housekeeping. Obviously, the session is best if we stay muted. If you do have anything that you want to add, or you want to say something, please just raise your hand, and then we can activate your microphone. And we'd ask you to use the chat box for any questions or sharing comments while others are speaking. We will be recording this session for later viewing and referencing, and also we'll be putting the PowerPoints up that we use. So for today's session, we're not supporting athletes holistically during COVID-19. I would like to say that I put that in as something to make sure that everybody was awake, but I made a mistake there, so that's the first one of the day. But we are going to talk about criteria and targeting, and some maybe alternate strategies for you to use. We've obviously got Todd from CSI Pacific, who's going to give us a little bit of a presentation after I've spoken. And then we're going to go into some breakout rooms, and we're going to encourage you to discuss and maybe open up about some of the things that you're finding challenging at the moment. And we've got a series of questions that we probably would ask to maybe stimulate that conversation. And then we will come back together, and then we'll be looking at sharing best practices. So let's get going. So 2020 then has not been a great year for us in terms of sport. So pretty much everything in sport has been cancelled of late. So most national championships, if they've not been cancelled already, have been postponed or put on hold. Provincial and regional championships have sort of had the same fate. At the same time, any identification or selection events that were scheduled have obviously fallen by the wayside, alongside training camps as well. Anybody who was in regular league play at the moment is now finding themselves sort of on the sideline waiting to see what will happen as we move forward. And daily training environments have just been simply disrupted. A lot of our athletes are training in groups of one. We know a lot of people are doing workouts on Zoom. So we know that people have been pretty good at making adjustments, but it's not the same. And I think that we're all seeing that now, having been in this world for 2 months, that the Zoom meetings or the Microsoft Team meetings are great, but it's just not the same in terms of being able to connect with your athletes and coaches and with your staff. So the effect on sport has been simply this. I used this slide last week and I kind of like it, so I thought I would use it again. But this is really where we find ourselves. We're kind of in this area of nothing happening. So how is sport responding? How are we responding around the world, and how does that fit into us? So we can see, and we read about this and we hear about this every day, where our professional leagues are just scrambling to come up with any alternative that they can. We know that the NHL are talking about possibly playing in regional hubs, and that might be great for some Canadian cities who are able to provide those regional hubs. We know that the NBA have had discussions about taking the players maybe all to one place to play those games, or to split East-West. I know that Shaquille O'Neal has made a statement where he suggests that the rest of this season should be cancelled. And obviously, if you're a Toronto Raptors fan, then you would be supportive of that, because that means that the Raptors will be champions for another year. I'm not sure if Shaquille's going to get his wish there. Major League Baseball, we're looking at a delay of the season, and my understanding is there's some discussion around with the Players Union as to whether they will even come back. So Major League Baseball is in a real tight spot at the moment. We saw that the Bundesliga, which is the German first Premier Division, started last week. Two kind of mixed responses. Players scoring goals and celebrating scoring in a socially distanced manner. It's probably not the spirit of the game for the fans. So certainly in terms of soccer, it looks as if the fans are not part of any return to sport process, which appears to be the case, across the board. The Tour de France have suggested that they would move this to later this year. The last update that I had heard was possibly October, but again, that may end up being cancelled. We know that Formula One have cancelled a series of their races and delayed a lot of their races. And we saw at the weekend where the Belgian Grand Prix will go ahead, but obviously without fans. Those of you who class NASCAR as a sport would have been pleased to see NASCAR back this weekend, but again without fans. So it was a lot of left turns, almost in a car park environment, because there were no fans there. In soccer, the European Championships were postponed to 2021, so they were just moved a whole year away. And obviously that has a knock-on effect around other tournaments. The Women's European Championships was moved a whole year away as well, so it's not a clash. And then obviously the biggest event, the Olympics, was postponed to 2021. So we can see that there are huge challenges facing the world of sport. And I read a report last week where in terms of soccer in the United Kingdom, they're looking at a £700 million hole. So we're looking at up north of $1 billion Canadian that will probably not come back into the sport, and obviously that'll have knock-on effects all the way across a series of platforms. So how does this affect you, or how does this affect us? Because we're not all in that professional environment. We may be closely linked in some areas, but we're not in there, and so it has a different effect on us. So how do you make selections for future events if we don't have any competition? So how do we select people? How do we pick a team or pick a training group when we have no event to make selections from? Now, when I think about this, and this point that I want to make here is simply around being a coach. So not having the competitions is a challenge, but the greater challenge for us as coaches, and not wanting to put too much of a coaching slant on this, is without that opportunity to match people up, how do you justify those decisions? And I put there, how do you justify those decisions to stakeholders, but also how do you justify those decisions to yourself? As coaches, our job is generally around selection, and you have to feel comfortable with the decisions that you've made. So this is a challenging time for us because we're not in a position where we're getting to see our athletes so that we can make those decisions. And then we saw at the back end of last week, early this week, those return to play discussions that were going on in BC seem to have stalled a little bit due to issues around liability. So obviously we have to recognise that is a big issue for us. And if we think back to what professional sport are trying to do, they're trying to get back on the field as quickly as they can. But this liability issue may be a challenge for us going forward. And there is a scenario here where we don't see the field, or we don't see activity for what could be a long time. So why do we ask? Why do we, CSI Pacific, ask for criteria? Well, we're looking for justification for why athletes are selected or nominated into this development pathway. And this process is tied to enhanced excellence funding, so there's definitely some skin in the game for the sports there, and it's a key procedure for us. And obviously for targeted athletes and coaches, we at CSI Pacific can offer this comprehensive support program through our athlete and coach services program. So we're really proud of the work that has been done there, because we feel that we offer a great support program to people who are targeted as athletes and also as coaches. Now, in normal times, selection is usually based on results. We would have a competition, and the team that wins, we would say that maybe that's the best team. But all of us in sport know that results don't always tell the full story. Sometimes they do tell the full story, as we saw last year with Louisiana State University being national champions. So I'll just leave that there for just a few more seconds, just so everybody can recognize that. So just a little bit of a vanity project for me there. So today's proposed outcomes. We're trying to identify common nomination challenges amongst PSOs. So we're looking to see what are the challenges that you face when it comes to this process. We want to try to look at opportunities to improve your existing athlete targeting through the change that we find ourselves in at the moment, and Drew's going to talk about that as we move through this afternoon. We're going to look at advantages and disadvantages of event-based criteria and performance-based criteria, because they are slightly different. Possibly show some modifications to some of the common problems that we see there, and try to highlight some PSOs who have made some adaptations to the situation that we find ourselves in here at the moment. So what I'm going to do now is I'm just going to change the slides here and bring Drew's slides in, and then we'll welcome Drew on board, and he'll go through his presentation. So if you just bear with me a second, and I'll line that up, and I'll hand over to Drew.
Awesome. Hopefully everybody can hear me. I think I'm good, but thanks, Andrew, for allowing me to...
Okay, Drew, I'll put myself on mute.
Oh, okay. Can you hear me? Everybody good? Yeah? Okay. Oh, sweet. Okay, there we go. But yeah, thanks for giving me the opportunity to come in and present to the Power and Podiums crew here. And thanks again for everybody for logging on today. I'd say thank you for giving up your lunch hour, but I mean, what is a lunch hour now? what is time these days? Super weird world we're living in. Andrew mentioned it at the beginning there with the Bundesliga, but it's a weird time when I'm getting up at 6:30 in the morning to watch German soccer. I don't even know what a Borussia Dortmund is, but I know that they're my boys, and apparently I hate something called Schalke now. So that's just the world we're living in. It's we're all trying to adapt. So kind of the main theme of the presentation today is sort of structured around, specifically adapting your nomination criteria and your athlete targeting, mostly for what CSI Pacific asks for on an annual basis. But I do want to reiterate that a lot of the sort of the strategies and the discussion that we're going to have today, it applies to more than just the criteria that you submit. So, it applies to team selection. That's a pretty obvious one. But I think a lot of this whole thinking around adapting to change translates into all parts of your program and all parts of your organization's, operations moving forward. So I have a bit more of a business background, so I kind of always try to look at problems and barriers and try to find solutions through that lens. So I've got a couple of quotes here from some prominent business thinkers that I really think will help us kind of frame the discussion today. And sure I can turn the slides? Yeah. So the first one here from Max McCown says, adaptability is about the powerful difference between adapting to cope and adapting to win. And I think what that kind of signifies is that, there's going to be a lot of us who are going to see the whole COVID situation as an impossible, barrier, a possible wall to get over. And really just the goal is to temporarily band-aid over whatever problems may arise. And I think there's going to be a lot of us out there who are going to see this as an opportunity to change and grow and use this time of crises to improve our existing policies and operations and programs. I really like the word that Andrew used in the intro there, disrupt. So I think disrupt and disruption is sometimes given a negative connotation because it's used a lot by like startups and .coms in the Silicon Valley world to drive up and inflate the value of their companies by saying that they disrupt their industry. But the reality is that everybody right now is being disrupted, whether we like it or not. So it's kind of about how we react to that turmoil and that disruption, and we have to find a ways to overcome it. And I apologize too. I just realized that the word adaptability is spelt wrong. So it's always a great presentation when the very first word has a typo in it. Apologize about that one. Drew Todd, crush from quarantines one word at a time. Let's hope it's the last one. The next quote is from Peter Drucker and says, as you can read, the greatest danger in times of turbulence is not the turbulence, it's to act with yesterday's logic. Now, obviously, these guys, when they came up with these lines, didn't apply them necessarily to a global pandemic, but I think the underlying reasoning still applies in that when we come out of this COVID situation, it's still going to be different, right? This isn't necessarily a temporary issue that we have to resolve. We have to approach everything we do with a new mindset, and we got to try new strategies to overcome them. And then sort of bringing it back to sport, there's one other quote I like here that kind of sums up everything best. It's from John Wooden, famous UCLA basketball coach. Adaptability is about being able to adjust to any situation at any given time, right? So the most adaptable organizations, most adaptable coaches, programs, staff, whatever the case may be, those are the ones who are going to be successful. And, I don't want to say we're going to see a reckoning necessarily in the system, but we're definitely going to be able to tell, which organizations are best prepared to succeed moving forward, which programs, which teams are best, because they're going to be the ones who are going to adjust to the situation and, still find ways to be successful. So I think Andrew already kind of went through the purpose here. Stole my slide, Andrew, but that's okay. Everybody likes an English accent, so the more words you get in, the better. Kind of looking at the common challenges that are going to be presenting during COVID. So Andrew went through a few of these, right? So I just want to kind of put up there as a bit of a disclaimer that we do understand at CSI Pacific that every sport is unique. So, there's no catch-all solution to every issue that may arise. And it's not just the demands of the sport that are different to everybody, but it's also, the organization you're in, the system you're in. You have different leadership and organizational structures. You have different resources, all of you. So what we're going to try to do today is just sort of present some solutions that could work for you, but if anything, maybe just sort of trigger an idea in your head that if something's working for one sport, that maybe you can apply it to your sport in a different context. So yeah, the big ones here, obviously a cancellation of key events. That's been crazy. Not only does it make it difficult to identify and target athletes, but I think Sarah Katie's on the call today. We were talking Tennis Canada. I mean, they've had to lay off a ton of staff due to the cancellation of the Rogers Cup. That was just an immense driver of their revenue. So when you cancel the key events, not only do you have difficulty finding out who your athletes are, but you lose the staff or the resources available to go out there and do the work to search out who the staff are, or who the best athletes are. So there's a lot of ramifications that kind of cascade down with these cancellations. Cancellation of training camps. As far as we know, the Canada Games are still going to go on next year in Niagara in July, August 2021. But there's probably a lot of sports out there that we're planning on using this summer to identify who they're going to send to Team BC and then spend the next year training them and building out that program. So that's going to be seriously affected. And kind of what Andrew's saying about the daily training environment being disrupted, athletes are no longer able to adhere to their training plan. So, what are we looking at when we target athletes if we have to understand that they're not going to be able to complete the work necessary that we put in front of them. So just give a quick overview of what we're talking about with this whole nomination process, criteria process. I'm going to use those words a lot throughout today. And I know that not everybody in the meeting is necessarily part of your PSO's sort of technical committee that develops these lists. So for a quick overview, this is what I call the kind of the chronological perspective. So phase one is about criteria development. So the PSO has to create targeting criteria based on a template that we give them that shows, who and why they're nominating to receive services and benefits from us. The next stage is nomination. So once the criteria is approved, the PSO sends us a list of athletes based on that criteria document. We approve the list, make sure everything's good. And then the last step is the athletes are notified that they can register with any of our 8 centers across BC. And then they come and do so. They get an athlete card, gives them access to thousands of dollars of VIK high performance benefits. In my experience, sometimes a few people or PSOs have a bit of a difficult time kind of wrapping their head around sort of that explanation of the nomination. So I sometimes talk about it in what I call like a reverse engineering perspective. And it just becomes a bit more simple kind of understanding it. So I'll rip through this quickly, but the end goal of this whole process is to identify the athletes that are currently targeted in your sports podium pathway, right? The ones that you identify are the ones that get the service, but we're doing this to note, who slots in where in the podium pathway. So working backwards from that, in order to identify those athletes, it makes sense that we have to settle on a method to justify the targeting. That goes back again to what Andrew was saying earlier. We have to make sure that our stakeholders, there's a logical reasoning behind what we do and how we allocate resources to athletes. Justification implies showing evidence of past performance. So, when you're nominating athletes to the list, it has to be based on what they've already done. What have they already shown us to justify being on that podium pathway? We can't necessarily say that this athlete's on the podium pathway because I know he's going to medal at the next month's tournament or competition. That's not necessarily fair, right? That's all hypothetical. Not saying that athlete wouldn't necessarily be nominated, but you have to have clear evidence of them being successful. And then the criteria document is really just a summary of all that evidence and all that justification. So we don't want the PSOs necessarily to send us all the supporting information on every single athlete, but it all kind of wrapped up into one document that shows kind of how they went about coming up with the list. So just a quick example, layman's terms. Is John Doe currently in the podium pathway? Well, then you can say, yes, he is at this level because I have data saying he did this, etc. So every sports criteria looks slightly different, but that's just sort of an example of what we're talking about, why we go through this whole nomination process. So the next couple slides I have, I used them at a previous Powering Podiums I presented at about a year and a half ago on data analysis. And we were sort of really looking at, is it possible to use the data that we have on hand to identify athletes? And I kind of challenged those in attendance with the 2 questions that you're seeing up there on the screen. So, outside of competition, are you doing anything to identify high potential athletes? Without the resources to monitor everybody, are there ways that data analysis can help identify them? And I didn't realize, I was able to see the future back then because now more than ever, we don't have competition to identify our athletes. So we have to come up with other ways, other strategies to be able to understand them that don't require us to see them with our own 2 eyes. The budget and the capacity may not be the issue. Literally getting outside of your house is going to be a problem right now because, obviously we're still all kind of in quarantine, even though we're starting up a slight bit of restart in the province. And then I kind of went on to explain just sort of what the 2 types of targeting criteria are. Andrew briefly mentioned, I think, at the beginning. So we have what we call event-based criteria, and we have performance-based criteria. And we think that the best sort of ways of targeting athletes has a combination of both these 2 types. So when we say event-based criteria, we're usually looking at like a specific or a singular occurrence that happened, typically based around competition. So you might say that this athlete's on the podium pathway because they medaled at one singular or one specific event, nationals. or they made the junior national team to go compete at Worlds. Stuff like that. And that's sort of the very traditional way of looking at podium pathways, looking at identifying potential in athletes. Did they make certain teams? Did they succeed at certain competitions? That kind of thing. So the other category is what we call performance-based criteria, and this is kind of what we're trying to push more PSOs into incorporating into their practices. And it's performance-based is really sort of ongoing, continuous measurements of performance throughout the year. So it looks at sort of the whole input that goes into athlete development, not necessarily just the outcomes, which is a bit more kind of the event-based side of things. So for a performance-based measure, some of you have probably heard of things like gold medal profiles, winning style of play. A great performance-based measure could be that athletes at the provincial development level need to hit 3/4 of train to compete gold medal profile benchmarks. Just an example. So kind of combining the two of these different types of targeting criteria, the analogy I like to use, again, maybe goes back a bit to my business background, but it's kind of like an investment portfolio. So, I don't want to talk about how bad the economy and the stock market is done right now, but let's just sort of think about this as a hypothetical. Ideally, your investment advisor is recommending that you diversify your investments, right? So you want to purchase some, bonds, some high-risk stocks, some high-dividend yield stocks, put some money into real estate, that kind of thing. And it's all based around the idea that you want to be able to mitigate risk as much as possible while still giving you the opportunity to have the greatest gains. Applying that to the criteria process is we want to make sure that we're not missing any high-potential athletes in the province, but we're still focusing and capturing and spending most of our resources on the best athletes who have that potential to get to the national system. Now that's not to say that, I know we're pushing more performance-based criteria, but it isn't perfect. Both types of these criteria have strengths and weaknesses, advantages and disadvantages. Looking at event-based criteria, the advantage of this is that ultimately in sport, what are we trying to do? We're trying to win. We're trying to win on the biggest stage. So we need to have some sort of way of identifying athletes that is actually based on, the success that they've had on the stage. It's performance on demand, right? Some athletes are great in the training environment, but they just can't bring it when it matters the most, right? And so, how much are you going to invest in an athlete who's ultimately going to disappoint when you need them the most? Now, it's got some negatives too, obviously. It doesn't necessarily adjust for relative age and various growth spurts. So if you build your development pathway based on, say, U12 provincials, U14, U16, U18, well, chances are your entire high-performance program is going to be looking at the athletes who had, hit puberty first. They're going to be winning at an earlier stage, but they may actually be the worst athlete in the long term. You just didn't give the late developers really that opportunity. It also doesn't account for alternative pathways. So I don't know if anybody on the call is from rowing, but I think rowing's a great example of a sport that looks at other sports for athletes to transfer into theirs. I think a lot of the guys on the senior national team, a lot of the girls too, are they didn't come up through the junior ranks in rowing, but they're huge, big, strong, long levers, legs, arms, great rowers, right? And so if you're only looking at the athletes that have been in a program since 12, 13 years old, you might be missing the opportunity to, lack of a better term, steal athletes from other sports who would be better suited for yours. Then on the performance-based side, so it obviously has a lot of pros that I've mentioned already, but like I said before, it captures a broader scope of what athlete development is, right? It doesn't necessarily just look at a singular outcome. It looks at all the different aspects of athlete development, your technical, your tactical, your physical makeup, your mental makeup, that kind of stuff. And it really looks at the long term over immediate results. So I think one thing we also try to impart to many of the provincial programs is that the ultimate goal of your high performance system should be to get more athletes onto national teams, not necessarily perform well in domestic championships. Sometimes those two things can be perfectly aligned, but then sometimes you're focusing too much on athletes that don't really have the long-term potential, but are going to be successful at a younger age. So you're almost wasting your resources in some senses. And I put in quotation marks the process. So if anybody's an NBA fan here, they probably know what that's all about. The Philadelphia 76ers a few years ago kind of had a motto that was sort of given to them called "Trust the Process." And their old GM, Sam Hanke, kind of gamed the system and identified that in order to be successful in the long term, they need to have superstars. So what they did is they absolutely flat out tanked for a couple years in order to get those high draft picks. Was it moral? Was it ethical? That's questionable for sure. But in the end, they're now a contender, and they've got some star players on their team. So they were terrible in the short term, but that has led to better and greater long-term success for them. There's also cons too for the performance-based criteria. So one of the cons there is I put the Kenny Powers principle. I don't know if anybody's seen the show. It's probably not suitable for work, so I won't have any video clips of it. But it's a comedy on HBO about a washed-up baseball player trying to get back into the sport. And I'm not going to summarize it too much, but there was a line that he used very early on in the series saying, "I don't want to be the best at working out. I want to be the best at, or I play real sports," or something like that. Kind of implying that it's a little tongue-in-cheek, but we do have to recognize that the ability to actually play the sport in competition does matter. So we don't want to focus our development programs on only training in the gym and stuff like that, because then we get kind of lost we sort of lose sight of the forest for the trees, or whatever that saying is. And then another con too is they can be very challenging to implement, especially for some smaller PSOs that don't quite have the resources of larger ones. And definitely they take time and years to build that kind of performance-based structure. So we're just kind of getting near the end here, but I want to go through some examples, both hypothetical and real world, of some modifications that have been made. So we're still, I know it kind of feels like we've been quarantined forever, but relative to kind of long-term planning, we're still pretty early in the whole COVID crisis. So I don't have a ton of sports that I've worked with in a real setting having to make these modifications, but there's a few that I'll show you. But this first one here is a common criterion I've seen across a lot of sports. Something very similar to the athlete has to finish, say, top 3 at a senior national championships in order to get on that list. Well, as we've been kind of explaining this whole time, that most national championships have been canceled. So what do we do? So there's tons of different solutions, but I've got just a couple ones here that might work well for your sport. First one is the simplest one. If you don't have nationals, maybe there was still a high-level competition that happened over the last year that you could just simply sub into your criteria document for this 1 year and use the results of that event to help target your athletes. A second solution might take a little bit more time and you have to be a bit more creative, but say you have 3, 4, 5, even 10 mid-level competitions that occurred over the last year that you can go through the results at each of them and develop some sort of ranking system. And you actually might find out that that could be a stronger indicator of athlete potential because it shows a bit more about consistent results over the year rather than the risk you take of focusing solely on an athlete who is successful in one particular weekend, possibly. You get an athlete who has shown consistent success throughout an entire season. So a couple of the sports here that I've worked with recently, so Wrestling BC is one of them. Their annual cycle goes from June 1st to May 31st. So just a couple of weeks ago, we finalized their criteria and their nomination list. But as we were kind of going through the document, we found that one of their criterion for targeting athletes was they have to place in the top 2 at the most recent national U17s. Well, that event was supposed to go on in April, and obviously it was canceled. So as we kind of talked things out and discussed it, so we decided, or wrestling decided, that a nice replacement for that is the athlete has to win 2 of the following 3 competitions. So these 3 all did occur in the previous 12 months: War on the Floor, BCH Class Championships, and BCSSWA Championships. So I would say what we did is we actually raised the standard. So instead of having to finish top 2, they had to flat out win at least 2 of those 3 events. But that sort of made up for the fact that it was lower level competition. So it's a nice sort of replacement that we use for the lack of a national championships. And who knows? We're going to give it a year, and depending on what things look like next year, we may find out that this is a criteria that actually does a better job of identifying potential, and we can leave it in there permanently, even if nationals come back. Another example of a modification was with BC wheelchair basketball. So they have the same annual cycle, June 1st to May 31st. And one of their criteria for the Canadian development level was athletes have to be selected to the U23 or the U25 national team. However, because there's going to be no international competitions for them to go to, nor was there any ability to centralize in Toronto, they just didn't select those teams this year. Then through, again, discussing different strategies to get around it, well, we kind of discovered that the NSO actually maintains a depth chart for each position in each of those teams and for each classification of athlete that goes 12 deep. So this is something that the NSO has been monitoring all year round. And even though they use the selection camp that happens in the summer, that's kind of a final thing, they have a pretty good idea of who their best athletes are in the country. And I would say it doesn't get more aligned to an NSO than literally taking a list that's in the NSO head coach's office and applying it to your own criteria. And so we subbed this one in, and it was verified by the NSO, and I think that's probably an example of a criteria that we're going to use more consistently next year and the year beyond in wheelchair basketball. A great example of using this crisis as an opportunity to develop a better way of targeting athletes than to kind of simply taking the easy route of just doing the same thing year over year. Now, because there's been so few sports that have had to make any modifications, I don't really have any real-world examples yet of a performance-based one, but I'll just give you an example of another modification that I think might apply to a lot of sports. So the sports that do have performance-based criteria in their plans tend to mostly focus on physical benchmarks, which is totally fine, and it's something that's pretty common across the system. But what happens if you were assessing those athletes at an annual fitness depot or a testing camp, and then you no longer have the ability to identify athletes based on their physical makeup? Well, one modification could be to just adapt the tests that you were going to do for home and have athletes self-report those results. Now, I know that solution probably doesn't work for everybody, and it's definitely fraught with some, could be some problems, like the protocols aren't going to work out right. Does every athlete have access to the same training environment to do the test, et cetera, et cetera? But at the very least, it's maybe a way to come up with some sort of logical reasoning, get some sort of data that you can utilize as part of your selection. Or another one might be very simple, right? Some sports do multiple fitness testing throughout the year to kind of measure ongoing performance and improvement, not just an isolated one. So if you have testing data from 5-6 months ago, maybe just use that instead. And if you have sort of multiple data points, you could possibly prorate that athlete's test to what you expect them to have gotten at the testing camp that may have been canceled. So these are just kind of 2 solutions, but there's tens, probably hundreds of ways that we can modify all this criteria to come up with inevitably what our ultimate goal is knowing who our best athletes are, where they fit in the pathway, and having the ability to sort of justify that beyond saying, I saw it at a competition, or they made a certain team, et cetera, et cetera. So that kind of just wraps things up for me here, so hopefully I didn't bore you too much, but I know we're going to get into some sort of small breakout group discussion, but before then, does anybody in the meeting today have a question for me about anything I've discussed? No? Okay, well then I guess I'll pass it back to you, Andrew, and we can go from there.
Yeah, thanks, Drew. I thought you made an interesting comment there around when we have competition. So sometimes athletes or sometimes teams can overachieve at the right time for them and are sometimes selected to the next level when they're not in fact ready. And I think that can have a detrimental effect on their development because we're putting them in an environment where they're just not able to compete. So as you were speaking, I thought that's another example of sometimes where, I'm not sure what the phrase is, competition is a good servant but not a great master, and maybe that's another example of why that basing everything around competition and results is not so positive for us. So yeah, thanks very much, Drew. That was fantastic. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to hand over to Candice, and Candice is going to talk us through the next piece here as we move into the breakout room. So I'll just put myself on mute here, Candice.
Thanks, Andrew. Thanks, Drew. Drew, that was a fabulous job of really breaking things down. Hopefully everyone on the call was able to grab something from there, and everyone that is watching this after. Drew, Andrew, if you'd like to stop the recording, this is just breakout logistics, and we can re-record. A little bit was happening with speed skating, and then maybe we'll move to Drouin to share what happened in her group, and then finally we'll get Drew to maybe share, or have someone from his group share some of the takeaways that we can all learn from. Drew, Andrew, are you recording again?
Yeah, we're back up and going.
Awesome. All right, I'm gonna just unmute Chris here. Where are you? All right, folks, I'm just gonna find Chris here and unmute, enable microphone. All right, you're on.
Hi, you can hear me?
Yep, we got you, Chris.
Perfect. Sorry to the people in my group, you'll hear this again, and Drouin, you obviously know this, I've worked with Drouin already. We're two disciplines in speed skating, long track and short track, and long track is a time-based sport. Luckily, we had enough of our major events happen that we didn't have to alter any of our long track criteria for our nomination list, which comes up in June. On the short track side, though, we didn't have enough of our events happen, and short track is a very position-based sport. It doesn't really matter how fast you're going. If you win the race, you win the race. But we did have to sort of take a page from long track and go to a more time-based system for short track to be able to finish our ranking. So particularly for one piece of the criteria, I looked back at the same competition the previous year and looked at the speeds that the skaters were skating, the times that they were skating the previous year, and then had to use time-based ranking from events that did happen this year to see who had met those time standards. So it was a little bit of a deviation from the usual types of criteria that we would use in short track, where we don't typically use time-based criteria, but it'll work. It's a decent enough approximation.
Thanks, Chris. That was, I think it is just an adaptation that it looks like it is going to work for sure. Maybe some other sports could potentially do the same thing. Drouin, did you want to take over and share yourself, or have someone share from your group?
Yeah, I can kind of summarize. For our group, we had a good chat. We had a lot of events canceled, and I know for gymnastics, their entire competition season essentially has been written off now. So just kind of brainstorming and talking about different ways to potentially identify athletes and how different PSOs are currently doing that. So we've got some virtual training that's happening with some groups. where they're able to coach and do some IST stuff with their athletes, which is great. And then just kind of what it will look like, you know, in the future, and how to potentially continue to target and track these athletes and getting them back into more training camp environments. I know volleyball spoke and with their selections not taking place, but bringing in more of a camp environment potentially to start to target and recognize athletes in that perspective. So just a lot of great discussion in our group and just kind of ideas and how each sport, it's very different with individual sports or individual athletes competing in sport and team environment sports. You know, everyone kind of has to navigate that in a different way and what they have the resources to. So it was, yeah, it was a good discussion and some good ideas coming forward.
Then I guess I can jump in for our group. So yeah, same kind of thing, some good discussions. Had a nice mix between both summer and winter sports, and kind of found it interesting the overlap of sort of when COVID hit us, and that for winter sports they got the majority of the season in, but just all had to pretty much cancel nationals. Whereas, you know, with the summer-based sports, it's all kind of about selecting your team moving forward. That's going to be really affected. Possibly there's going to be for starting up later on. We also talked about the differences kind of between, like Gurveen said, individual team sport, and then often with the individual sports, there's multiple disciplines. So, you know, how do you kind of work around the different training requirements for different disciplines within your own sport? And then we kind of talked about kind of how the NSO is guiding PSOs right now, and what does that look like, if there's anything at all, you know. Is the NSO making, they've been flexible with their team selections? How are they going about it? Do we have the same opportunities provincially that they have? Have they begun to schedule events? So, you know, a lot of it is just a bit more of discussion, more questions than answers in a lot of cases. But I think we're all kind of on the same boat and really starting to think about different solutions to get into who our best athletes are and how we're going to move forward, which I think is it was just fantastic.
Great, thanks Drew for that, and thanks to Candice for managing those meeting rooms for us. Just wondered if anybody has any questions or any comments or any points they'd like to make prior to us wrapping this up, and that obviously includes Candice, Gurveen, or Drew.
I think that just one last point that would be nice to make is just looking at our para sports and how there's it's a bit of a different scenario with a lot of those sports where you know, making sure that the athletes are not being missed you know, or kind of lost through that. I don't know if there are any other sports on the call besides Michelle, Fanny Smith as well. But I don't know if before we wrap up, if Michelle would be able to share a little bit about kind of some of the challenges that you might perceive happening. Give you an enable your mic.
Hi everybody, and I apologize in advance if you hear a dog howling. Yeah, so I'm wheelchair tennis, but I work for BC Wheelchair Sports, and so for us, not only was our entire season canceled, and we are part of the Tennis Canada cuts, significant cuts, but we also, it's looking like we'll be away a lot longer, even maybe than able-bodied tennis. And just our ability to return to anything, even fitness testing, individual training, is going to be hampered just by the added risks of being a para athlete. And it's not the same for every athlete, certainly, but we have to look at the system, our system as a whole, and what the risk is for those people, and kind of how we need to stay away from them right now as much as possible. And then the added layer of, you know, you say do the testing at home. Well, you can't like do wheelchair testing in a driveway or a street, right? Like you need a gym space or you need a tennis court. So it's those are some of the challenges that we're working through, I think. And I think it's the same in athletics. And I know Anna's on the call, but that's kind of where we're at right now.
Thanks, Michelle. I thought that was just a really good point to make. So thank you for sharing.
Okay, well, thanks everybody. Just want to thank Drew, Candice and Gervine for the work they put in here. And obviously a big thank you to you guys for taking time out of your day. And hopefully there was something in this for you. And we'll put a recording up on our website along with the slides, and that'll be available, I'm hoping, later this week or early next week. So again, thanks everybody. We'll be taking a break from Powering Podiums for a little while here, and we plan to be back a little bit later in the year. So thanks everybody. Stay well. I don't say it as well as Bonnie Henry, but hope everybody is well and stay well. Go Tigers.